Most of the crucial pieces in Middle-earth had an impact on Elrond's life, from when his parents carried away Cimmeril, to him deciding to take the path as an immortal elf, to his role in the Battle of the Last Alliance, and all the way to when he was counseling the Fellowship on what to do with the One Ring. We'll be going into Elrond's life in the lore and comparing that to how he's portrayed in the Rings of Power. I'll be joined by Alex Holmgren, and don't forget to like and subscribe. So with that, let's dive right in. Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. During this intermission between the Rings of Power Season 2 and Season 3, I'll be going over different characters of Middle-earth along with different artifacts of Middle-earth, and also the War of the Rohirrim and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, looking at lore accuracies and inaccuracies. If you want to go back and listen to our Season 1 review, then go to the beginning of the podcast on any of those audio platforms. If you're on YouTube or those podcasting platforms, then you can search Season 2, Episode 1 review, and it should come up. Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the White City Podcast. Today I have with me a new guest, Alex Holmgren, and he'll be joining me today to discuss about Elrond. And Alex, tell us a little bit about your podcast and what you do with that.
Yeah, so I host a little podcast on Spotify called A Leisurely Stroll Through Middle Earth. And I'm basically going through and doing like an audiobook style reading for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit before that. I know plenty of other people have done it better, but it's just been something I've enjoyed doing, and nobody's tried to stop me yet. So
Nice. Oh man, that's true. I definitely feel a lot of the same way with things. So something I kind of ask guests like for the first time is like, how'd you get into Lord of the Rings? Was it through like reading the books or like watching the movies first, or yeah, how did that work?
yeah, I ended up I watched the first movie, and then I enjoyed it so much that I had to know what happened next. So I picked up The Two Towers and then Return of the King before those two came out. And then I realized I never actually went back and read the first one. And so then I went back, read Fellowship of the Ring. And I'd still say Fellowship is probably my favorite book of them all.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
got such that sense of like you're hopping into something, not having a clue what's going on, kind of like the hobbits probably felt. It's like they knew a little bit of what was going on, but then they come up across these situations where they're just like, okay, we're meeting a guy who sings a lot of weird songs and he has boots on. Uh,
Yeah.
so I've just been in love with it ever since.
That's cool. Yeah. I just like kind of went through that for like the second time actually. So it was no, it was really cool. Really cool to kind of
Yeah.
remember some of that and see like okay, there's a lot here that's different from the movie, you know. So, okay, so to what would you say you would attribute the success in Tolkien's works?
I would say it's the timeless themes, especially it's cliche, but good versus evil, and doing it in such a way that you're seeing different facets of it being relatable. Like as a kid, you're seeing it more from the kind of that black and white standpoint of it's like, yeah, the good guys are over here, the bad guys are over here. And then as you're getting older, realizing, like Boromir, for example, growing up, I thought Boromir was a total tool, hated him. I was like, it was sad when he died, but at the same time, kind of felt like, well, you kind of had that coming, buddy. But then as I got older, realizing that, hey, you know what? Boromir was just trying to do what he thought was good for his people. And once he was done, when he failed to get the ring, he kind of woke up, came back to himself, and was like, oh my God, what have I done? And
Yeah.
then seeing, you see people like Denethor and Saruman, who they start out as good, but then circumstances, the stresses they're under, their goals, they go down this dark path. And I think we can all relate to having a time when we're having a moment of trying to do the right thing or what we think is the right thing. But then you look back on it and you're like, oh man, that was awful. I can't believe I did that. You know, um,
Right.
there's that relatability. And
Yeah.
then seeing like the counter side of like having compassion for your enemies, having like the Frodo and Sam having pity for Gollum. In my Dead Marshes podcast episode, my friends and I, we discussed the fact that Frodo is having sympathy for Gollum because he's seeing him and he's realizing I'm going through some of the same things that Gollum probably did. Gollum had this ring for about 500 years. I've had it for a relatively short amount of time, but he's able to see himself in this person who's suffering. Even Sam, when Gollum's not around, is having moments where he's pitying Gollum. Now then Gollum shows up, says something creepy, and then ruins it, but, you know,
Yeah.
it's that theme of many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Do not be too hasty to pour out death and judgment. Even the
Yeah.
very wise can't see all ends. And that
Yeah.
just, I love that. And I think that is, even though it's more pertaining to like Frodo and Sam's part of the journey, it's such a relatable part of it that I think it stands the test of time and it keeps pushing forward into the future.
Yeah. No, yeah, definitely agree. And seeing like that speech of Gandalf to Frodo, which I can't remember. It's like it's somewhere else in the book, but
Yeah.
it's one of like my favorite parts of that in the movie, especially in like in Moria when Gandalf's telling Frodo that, and it's just like a classic idea of like, hey,
Oh,
this is
yeah.
timeless.
And especially when at that time, Frodo, he's like, oh, if only Bilbo had just killed him. And it's like, no, you shouldn't be wishing death on somebody.
Yeah,
Who are you to decide who lives and who dies?
yeah.
So,
So yeah, I think something we had kind of already touched on a little bit before the podcast, but just talking about different characters, especially ones that are in the Rings of Power, and comparing them to like how they're portrayed in the lore,
mhm.
right? So I know you said your his favorite character, at least in the Rings of Power, is Elrond. So
Yeah.
can you give like a I know just kind of a summary more or less of kind of well actually first I'll say is how about like an idea of what influenced Tolkien to come up with Elrond, and kind of like is there like anything like something that you could say to that?
Well, I do know, at least as far as like using Elrond in The Hobbit, it kind of sounds like he more or less drew the name out of a hat. Like he had already had this character idea in his head, but then it was like, okay, how can I link this story that's very much for children but still link it more so with the greater Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion. And when you think about it, Elrond is a perfect character for that, because a lot of the First Age affects his younger life, and then Second Age, it's kind of more his, I guess you could say, his midlife, mid-adulthood. And then by the time the Third Age activities happen, he's really kind of the elder quest giver, the counselor, the person who gives advice. And it's like he's lived through enough that it's like, okay, he has a really good idea of what good advice looks like. And it doesn't necessarily include telling people what to do as much as, well, these are your options, and I'm going to explain to you what each of these options could lead you to.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think like some of that too kind of connects with Rivendell kind of being like that place of rest, in the Fellowship and the Hobbit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because by the time they reach Rivendell, in both The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, the characters have gone through their first major moment of peril, where it's like, oh, this could be the end of your journey right here. And a friend of mine on the podcast, we were talking about it, and it's interesting how you have these moments of high action, high stress, and then boom, gets you to that nice calm place. Things are peaceful, they're safe. And it's like they need that restful point before they can continue on with the rest of their journey.
Yeah. And one comment on like the resting place,
Yeah.
kind of similarly, like one friend who was like on my podcast with me talks about different resting places in Lord of the Rings, and because we were talking about Tom Bombadil and the Rings of Power, and how he had like a very ideal resting place for the hobbits at that time, and that
Yeah.
as the journey moves on, they have like almost like less of an ideal place to be resting at, like whenever the hobbits get to Gondor and I guess whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was just
Mm-hmm.
listening to a part on Lothlorien, and it's like their first night in Lothlorien, it says the hobbits were very uncomfortable because they're sleeping up in the trees. It's unfamiliar. Even if hobbits have an upstairs to their house, they never sleep up there. And so the idea of being this high up, there's no railing or walls. So it's literally like, if you're a rolling sleeper, you could risk just rolling right off the edge of the talon. And it's like, oh, whoops. Could have been a
Yeah,
very different story there.
for sure. Yeah. So getting into a little bit more about Elrond's his journey, just in Middle Earth. So can you just talk about more on kind of like his beginnings and then kind of breaking up to like the Lord of the Rings and where
Yeah.
he you know where he basically just kind of is at Rivendell.
Yeah. So Elrond, he in the First Age, he actually ends up getting raised by Maedhros, one of the sons of Feanor, because his mom, Elwing, had one of the Silmarils, and the sons of Feanor had this oath in place that it's like, no matter who has it, who has the Silmarils, they're going to go and reclaim their own. And, they were prepared to basically kill anyone who got in the way. They pursued Elwing to a cliff, and she jumps. And at first you're like, oh, yep, that's the end. But then Ulmo, the Valar of the waters and the ocean, turns her into a swan, and she flies off to join their father Erendil on his flying boat in the sky. Uh, and she delivers the Silmaril to him, and the Silmaril is then forever on the prow of his ship, where they can't get to it. Maedhros, and I forgot which other son of Feanor it was, to be honest, but they're basically stuck with these two half-elf children trying to be like, okay, it is kind of our fault that we made your mom jump off a cliff. So they had enough honor in them to be like, well, the least we could do is help raise these kids. And we have Elrond and Elros.
So,
Yeah.
so I was gonna say, all right. So so it's Elrond and Elros are the two half brothers. Okay. So who is it? Who's the elf of their parents then?
So that
Or are
was
you or are you?
Elwing.
Elwing's the elf, and then
And then Erendil
Arendelle
was
would
a
be
mortal man,
was the man. Okay.
but he basically got
Okay.
blessed with elfhood. And yeah, I guess if
Okay.
you're going to
Yeah.
cruise the skies forever, you want to be able to be immortal versus be kind of awkward to get there. It's like, oh, he's a skeleton driving the boat now.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, back to the Elrond and Elros.
Yeah. Well, and as we do know from Rings of Power, Elros starts the Númenórean society. He leads them for a really long time before he ends up dying because he chose to be of the path of mortal men, whereas Elrond chose to be of the elves. And so already from that standpoint, we know that Elrond is not unfamiliar with loss of family because his dad's gone, his mom's gone, eventually his brother is gone, and it kind of leaves him in this unique spot of like, okay, I am alone in the wide world. Fast forward a few hundred years, he's the official title, he was a herald under Gil-galad, and he was not directly given one of the Rings of Power until much later. He does have his moment where he tries to come to the aid of the elves of Eregion, the elf smiths, but it says in the text that his force arrived too late and they got routed, and Elrond, several of the survivors, went on to what later is going to become Rivendell. And it isn't until he gets Rivendell established that he gets given Vilya, the elven ring that up till now has been in Gil-galad's keeping. So then he's hanging out there until the Númenóreans come to help defeat Sauron. Elendil and his kinsfolk, they come to push back his forces. It's the greatest alliance of elves and men that have ever been gathered all in one place. But at this point, Númenor has been flooded. So the Númenóreans are in a position of, it's like, well, we got nowhere else to go back to. So what colonies are in Middle-earth, they're stuck there. Elrond then joins Gil-galad's forces to slowly make their way all the way to the slopes of Mount Doom. There is a very long siege of Barad-dûr in which several key characters get killed. You got Thranduil's father, he gets killed. The king of Lothlorien at that time, he gets killed. Anarion is Isildur's brother, he gets killed. And then finally on the slopes of Mount Doom, Gil-galad meets his end, and it says that Sauron grabbed him and the heat of him basically caused Gil-galad to get burned to death. And mind you, this is all without the Ring of Power on him. But it still says that Gil-galad and Elendil, they defeat Sauron, but not without getting mortal injury to both of them. So Elrond is trying to then advise Isildur that you need to get rid of this ring, and you gotta cast it in the fire. Isildur's like, no, I'm taking this as my weregild the cost for my family that I've lost in this struggle, because now Isildur is in very much the same position that Elrond was in near the beginning of the Second Age, where it's like he has no family now. He is alone. There's a son of his brother in Minas Tirith, and there is I believe his son is still in Rivendell at this point, but he's on this battlefield alone, and he's like, I lost everything. I'm gonna have something to claim from all this. And so, in a controversial move, Elrond lets him go ahead and do it. Everyone keeps saying Elrond should have just pushed him in, and it's like, well, not that simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
That could have made a very, very different Middle Earth as we know it.
That is
Yeah,
interesting.
and then you
'Cause you
have
think about like,
yeah,
yeah. I was just no, I was just gonna comment like you think about like other people like will talk about how like Frodo should have like just flown on an eagle and dropped the ring, and it's kind of like that response is like, well, would he have really just dropped the ring no matter what? You know,
right.
no matter what, like would he have really at that moment given up the ring entirely? But yeah,
Yeah, who knows if he actually would have gone for that. So I personally, I think it was the issue of the closer you got to Mordor, the more that ring was just having a tough influence. For all we know, it could have exacerbated the issue even more so, being so quickly brought that close instead of the gradual journey that they did. And there's the fact that eagles aren't exactly inconspicuous, especially at that size. And even in The Hobbit, they drop them. They drop off Gandalf and the dwarves and Bilbo on the edge of Wilderland because they're like, yeah, we don't want to get shot at because otherwise the men will shoot at us thinking we're trying to steal their sheep. So if they're worried about men with bows, I'm certain they would be worried about orcs with good enough bows. And I mean, who knows how long he had the fell beasts at his disposal. Could have just brought those out sooner.
yeah,
Easier said than done.
right,
So Elrond, he ends up going back with many of the elven survivors to Rivendell. And with the Ring of Vilya, he further develops it into this place of rest. Rivendell gets the title of the last homely house, because if you're traveling east after Bree, Rivendell is pretty much it. And then you're in the wilds for however long until you get to Rohan, the Lonely Mountain, or even Lorien. So he ends up marrying Galadriel's daughter, Celebrian, which that's something that I will say from Rings of Power. Really still not sure what they're doing there.
yeah. With the kiss and all at in that
Yes.
scene,
Yes, that's the
yeah,
only part where I'm just like, why? Uh,
yeah.
like,
It kind of, I think it does, yeah. It does kind of
like,
show of like, somebody, they're, anybody who makes an adaptation is gonna want to try to get money out of it, you know?
oh yeah,
And in my opinion, that was just like one way of stirring the pot. But
right. But then it's like they see each other again. Nobody says anything about it. Galadriel's not like, Elrond, what the heck was up with the kiss there? That was weird, man.
yeah,
Because, like, I understand, like, they were trying to pass the ring off without being noticed, but I feel like there was other ways they could have done that.
yeah.
Because it's not like he hid it in
It's
his
a
mouth or
great
something.
disservice.
It felt unnecessary. But you're right. It was
Oh, yeah, it
probably more
was.
just we're going to stir the pot so that everyone can be like, shipping is a big thing on social media. So it's like, oh, if we can ship people together, gets people talking and advertising. I
Yeah.
don't know. But he ends up marrying Galadriel's daughter, actually, and has 3 children, Eladan, Elrohir, and Arwen. And during the watchful peace, things are going good for a long time until Celebrian, his wife, is crossing the mountains from Lorien to Rivendell and gets abducted by orcs. Doesn't say exactly what happened to her, but Elrond and his son Eladan and Elrohir, they rescue her from the orcs, and he tries to heal her in Rivendell, but because of the hurt she suffered, she ends up going to the Grey Havens early and leaving. So whatever happened was serious
Okay.
enough that it scarred her so badly that she just couldn't stay around
Yeah.
anymore. So now you
Hmm.
have Elrond essentially made into a single parent, and it kind of shows to me with Arwen why he's so protective of her, why the idea of Aragorn marrying his daughter is no, you need to become the king of both Arnor and Gondor. You need to reunite those kingdoms, or you can't have my daughter's hand. So then we get to the time of Fellowship of the Ring, that the Hobbit and Fellowship of the Ring. He hosts Gandalf and the dwarves, and Bilbo reads the Cirith runes for them. And then in the movie, at least, he's like, this is probably not a good idea for you guys to go messing around with a dragon, but at the same time, I also don't approve of what dragons do, so I'm not going to tell you not to do it. Um,
uh,
and we get that fun White Council sequence, which kind of, I liked it because it shows those times when Gandalf would just disappear from the Hobbit. It at least gives some explanation of like, okay, what was he busy doing? What was he helping put into place? Made it so that it tied better into Lord of the Rings, which we know that's what follows after anyway. But I know some people were still not
yeah.
super fond of it. Uh, so he sends them on their way. What it doesn't show in the Hobbit film is they actually make a stop back in Rivendell on the way, and that is where Bilbo learns that the power in Dol Guldur has been overthrown for the time being. So they're still technically in this watchful peace era, but that really changes once Gollum finally decides to go out of hiding. They start to realize that it's like, no, the Nine are abroad again. They're looking for this ring. I'm sure Elrond's probably racking his mind thinking, I know Gandalf was down that way. And I know that Bilbo, this hobbit, was with him. He's the only person I saw come back. And they just, uh, Elrond's further just trying to, he's really good at just finding out what's going on. So he's sending out messengers. Aragorn, still living in Rivendell at this time, he's doing his part with the Dunedain Rangers to help keep the Western lands safe. So pretty much everything from Rivendell and that part of the Misty Mountains to the west, helping keep those lands safe. Because Breelanders and the Hobbits, they really have no standing military or sufficient protection available. Finally comes the time when Bilbo leaves the Shire, leaves his ring to Frodo, and Bilbo makes his way to Rivendell. Elrond welcomes him, gives him a place to rest, and Frodo, sometime later, is going on towards Rivendell himself because he's like, you know what? That's where Bilbo went. That sounds like as good a place as any to start. And he meets an elf named Gildor on the way, and it was probably like only a quarter of a way between the Shire and Bree that he meets this elf. And the elf somehow gets news back to Elrond that, hey, Frodo is going to you guys. The Nine are after him for some reason. And at that point, I'm sure Elrond was able to put 2 and 2 together by that point, because really the only major purpose of the 9 is to seek out the ring. Isn't until Return of the King that they get used for other purposes. So Elrond starts to try and kind of fortify this last homely house to a point where, at the very least, in the film, he tells Gandalf they don't have the strength to fight off both Mordor and Isengard. But that at least kind of implies to me that it's like, okay, with his ring and with the defenses he has gathered, he could at least make a long siege out of one of those enemies. But if both actually had coordinated and tried to work together, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Then we have the iconic scene where Frodo crosses the Brewing Inn after being pursued by the Black Riders. He is saved by Elrond, causing the river to sweep away the ring wraiths. In the books, it was Elrond controlling the river, not Arwen. But Gandalf decided to make the figures of white horsemen appear, kind of as a, look at our white riders are better than the black riders.
Yes.
And then he spends many days tending to Frodo's injury of a Morgul wound, which is essentially a curse. In D&D terms, it's a cursed item, so it's like the longer you're exposed to the poisons of this, the worse it's looking for you, and you're probably going to get transformed into something else. The knife point of the dagger broke off in the wound, and it was slowly working its way towards his heart. Elrond managed, after a lot of effort, to rid him of this injury, but Frodo will always feel the scar from it, to the point where the anniversary of Weathertop and getting stabbed, he always is a little extra sick that day. But while Frodo was recovering, he's summoning all these lords from different locations, representatives from Gondor, the Lonely Mountain, Dale. I'm not sure why there wasn't a guy from Rohan there. Probably because of Saruman, I'm sure. You have Thranduil's folk represented. I'm sure there was representatives from the Grey Havens, and there's probably someone from Lorien there. And you had Bilbo, Gandalf, and he's hosting this council, basically putting together, okay, this is where we last knew the ring was. Now we're going to try and piece together how it got to where we're at now. How we know that this ring is what Gandalf believes it to be, which is the One Ring. And then after all that, then deciding what to do with it. He's even one of the ones who first counsels some of the elves from the Grey Haven say, why can't we just send it to the Valar, let them deal with it? And he uses this line of, too often have we fled to the west when our troubles have arisen. And that would be the first place that Sauron would expect us to flee with his ring. And there's no guarantee that the Valar would take it. This is a thing of Middle-earth. We kind of need to handle this ourselves.
Which is kind of unique for like an elf to say.
Oh, yeah. And I guess you could even take it from a spiritual standpoint as believers. It's like, you know what? We're going to have struggles that we deal with, but there's going to be moments where God's going to give us all the tools to handle it, but he's not going to just make it go away. At the end of the day, this is what he has put in your path, and he does not give us more than we can handle. Even if at the time it feels like it is.
Yeah.
So then Elrond lets the company stay I believe it was almost a year before the Fellowship actually went out again. But they wanted to make sure that all the 9 were destroyed, or at least unhorsed. So he sends out messengers again, this time sending them to secret places like Lothlorien, basically letting allies know, hey, I can't tell you what this company is doing, but what they're doing is very important. If they come by, please help them. And that's part of why they get into Lorien, because they're like, oh yeah, we heard you were coming,
Right.
but hey, where's Gandalf?
Which is interesting too, because it's almost like Galadriel knew like what was happening with Gandalf, but she was like, "Where is he at?" You know.
Oh yeah. And I think it's interesting how, you have that relationship of uh between these three ring. I almost wonder though if it's the fact that between Galadriel, Gandalf, and Elrond, you have the bearers of the three elven rings. I feel like there has to have been some sort of connection then between those three,
That's a good
even
point.
though at the time the movies kind of made it look like, again, weird romantic vibes there. But I think it just
Yeah.
comes from the shared responsibility for these very magical items that are, they're so intrinsically valuable.
Right. Well, also too, like you think about how the elves knew when Sauron put on the ring,
Yep.
and they're like, "Oh no!" and they like took off their rings because they didn't want him to know that they had
Yeah.
them either. So maybe there's also that kind of a connection between the three of them.
I
Yeah.
would think so. I liked the I liked just that exploring that idea of like, you know, even like in the Christian faith, there's the Trinity, which there's debate amongst fellow Christians on that one, but it's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But you have three items, three aspects of God. I don't know if as a Catholic he would have necessarily been doing that on purpose or not, but it makes for something interesting to think about. But those three into one, because they three have those rings, they're kind of making this I guess godhead, if you will. In Elrond you have the counselor. I mean, really all three of them, Galadriel, Elrond, and Gandalf, fit that counselor role. But I would say, like with Galadriel, you kind of end up seeing more of like this forcefulness, like not forceful in like a dominating sort of way, but it's like, okay, she's the queen of all elven kind. She is very powerful, and at times has to use that power to keep her lands and her people safe. Elrond, you see him as more of a healer, and then like a healer, somebody who's helping to fix the injuries of the world and of just injuries on people, like having his home be a place of rest. It's a place of refuge where it's like, okay, don't worry about the war. Whereas even in Lorien, they're like, oh, hey, orcs are on our borders right now. So we're going to hold them off for now. But just so you know, this is happening while you're here. So I've always kind of felt like Lothlorien was not as restful for them as Rivendell was. And then with Gandalf, you have the guy who's with you. Like the sense of like when you feel God's presence, when you feel that God is with you, that kind of fit more to me what Gandalf is doing. Because even in chapters in the Two Towers, you have uh, there's a part where Frodo is seeing Gollum and he's having this memory of what Gandalf told him about him. And Frodo ends up speaking almost kind of like how we speak when we're talking to God. He's like, okay, you see now that I have spared him, not fearing for my own safety. Sorry, that's a bit of a wonky rabbit trail off of Elrond there, but
No, that's still cool. I appreciate that kind of comparison. Yeah.
well, and then okay, so Elrond sends out his messengers, and then we're told that there was activity in the north. We're not necessarily shown what that activity was or who was all attacked. We know that eventually Bree gets attacked by bandits. We later figure out these guys were Saruman's goons. We know that the Lonely Mountain is getting attacked at the same time as Gondor. That's why none of the other free folk are coming out that way, because they got their own conflicts they're trying to stem the tide on. And finally, the ring gets destroyed. Elrond, along with Arwen and this whole entourage of elven royalty, including Galadriel and her husband, they come to Minas Tirith. And supposedly, Elrond and Arwen did have some... It's described as a bitter parting before she marries Aragorn. But I think it's the fact that right now, Elrond is feeling like, okay, I don't know if I can bear to lose anybody else. Whereas right now, Arwen is basically making the choice of all of Beren and Lúthien's descendants, which is being able to choose if you are of the elven race or the mortal race. And I think whether you have or haven't yet, we all kind of reach a point in our lives, at least once, where you just kind of have this feeling of just, I don't feel like I can take any more. And I think to a degree, that's where Elrond is sitting, because he knows that with the ring destroyed, the elven rings, they don't have power anymore. It's only a matter of time before they're going to have to leave those shores. And while he knows that the elves are going to live forever, he knows that if his daughter makes this choice, he doesn't know if he's ever going to see her again. Because he doesn't know. He knows that men have the gift of mortality, which is called the gift of Eru, but nobody knows what happens to the spirits of men once they pass on. So he is just a father who is feeling fear that his daughter is making a choice that's going to be irreversible. And I think in the movies we see great examples of that, like in The Two Towers. He's trying to really dissuade his daughter from making this choice. And a lot of people are like, oh, Elrond's such a jerk, he's mean. But it's like, if you were a father and your daughter was making a choice that from your perspective, you could never see her again, what parent wouldn't be like, short of chaining up their child, because obviously that's not an option, but how many of us would be like practically on our knees begging our children not to make that decision? But we know that eventually Arwen does choose to make that choice, and Elrond does give his blessing for it, because at least he knows, as far as her mortal life in Middle-earth, she is going to be safe. He then ends up going back to Rivendell and starts preparing to leave. At that point, he's preparing to go to the Grey Havens. He goes with Galadriel. Celeborn actually stays behind for a bit, but Gandalf, Galadriel, Elrond, Frodo, and Bilbo, and Círdan the shipwright, they end up going back across the sea to Valinor, and that's where their story pretty much ends.
Yeah. So one thing we just about it's like Elrond and his healing power. Do you think that Elrond would have been able to heal Frodo without the ring?
I think the ring contributed a large part to it. Because he was learning healing in his time there. I do think the ring kind of gave a lot of that assistance from a magical perspective. He kind of strikes me as one who, he has the book knowledge of how to heal, but he brings the ring out in those times when it's like, okay, the book knowledge isn't going to be enough. I need to really put some oomph into this, or else they're not going to make it.
Right. Okay. I got you. Well, yeah, that's a very detailed layout there of Elrond's life. Yeah, thanks, Alex. That was good.
Yeah.
So I think, I think one thing with just, I guess, yeah, so is with like Elrond's parents, since they were like human and elf, then their children could choose to be human or elf. So that's why Elrond chose to be an elf for whatever reason, and
Yeah.
Elros chose to be a man. So I think that is like it's a unique thing in Middle Earth, right?
Oh yeah.
Um, so it's like the only reason why Arwen was only reason why like Arwen was able to choose to like be mortal is because she was in that line, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It wasn't a common thing. I do like how the Rings of Power mentioned that only twice in living memory has a union between elf and mortal been attempted, and at that point they mentioned that, yeah, each time it ended in tragedy and death, and it's like, well, you're not wrong. Beren and Luthien, they had their struggles, and then the other example I think they were citing at the time was uh, Idril and Tuor during the siege of Gondolin, which from that bloodline
Yeah.
we get to Erendil and Elwing. And so it's cool to just kind of see the family tree, how it's like, okay, this rare decision keeps kind of being circled in this one family.
Yeah.
And
Right. So
yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say. Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna like move on to the Rings of Power
Yeah.
now and kind of compare Elrond a little bit there. He is he is one character I think who is done fairly well out of all of them.
Oh,
But
absolutely.
I guess yeah, like do you feel like that like in one way they make him seem to be a very young elf at that point.
Yeah.
And do you think that that's kind of like an accurate portrayal?
I would think so. And I do kind of like this idea of like elves having a different maturing rate, because when you think of how long lived they are, you know, a lot of people just automatically think the wise elf lord, or Galadriel being automatically as wise as she is. I know at first in season one, I wasn't a fan of it, of like the impulsiveness. But then season two really changed my mind, and mostly just because everyone continued to let her have it on that. It's like, oh no, we're not forgetting what you did. You caused all this trouble. It's your fault. um,
Yeah, that's a
but
good point.
in Elrond's case, I see it as there's always those characters they put in a story that are supposed to be our relating point. And I feel like Elrond, for the Rings of Power as we've seen it, is our relating point. Especially since Elrond is one of the few elven characters who has interactions with people from pretty much every race in Middle Earth. He has interactions with mortal men, hobbits, dwarves, elves. In this case, even some negotiations with the orcs, or attempted negotiation. Uh, but he's somebody who, I forgot exactly what the literary term is, but it's basically our lens for seeing the world is through his perspective. Like, I would
Okay.
argue that
Yeah.
it's even more so than Galadriel at this point. Like, she's of course crucial because we know how important she is later on, but
Yeah.
it just kind of I haven't felt as much of a connection with her. And who knows, maybe if you were to ask a female fan of Lord of the Rings, maybe they'd have a different answer. But at least that's what I felt throughout this.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
youthfulness, it's kind of goes to show almost that we're on the same footing with him. He's basically mid-adult, like his his 30s, if you will, in elf terms. He's not an elf lord yet, but he's working up to that point. He doesn't necessarily get invited to all the council meetings, but we're seeing him make that jump over to where, okay, hey, you're being given more responsibility now, and this is what it's going to look like.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And then, of course, just seeing his friendship with Durin, I've loved seeing his friendship with Durin.
Yeah, I agree too. I think that that has been pretty laid out pretty well. Um, so one thing with like Galadriel's portrayal is that like Galadriel should be quite a bit older than Elrond, right?
Yes, quite a bit.
So so it seems though that she is like, kind of the younger one who's being mischievous
Yeah.
or mischievous, and Elrond's, kind of like her peer in a sense,
Mhm.
which I guess that doesn't that's not necessarily what the lore is like laying out.
Yeah. Which I will say, that's another, those are my only kind of issues with Rings of Power thus far, because it's just been kind of the scale of ages. They don't quite, in my mind, communicate effectively. And it's like, I think Morvith Clark and Robert Arameo have done an excellent job portraying the characters. But the fact that it's like, by this point, Galadriel has learned literal magic from the feet of a Maiar, which for all intents and purposes is an angel. Like, she is
Yeah.
supposed to be incredibly wise by this point. So I will say, from that standpoint, I was a little disappointed. I was expecting to see a little more. I could see her as a younger character, maybe more impulsively using said powers, not trying to like turn her into a Jean Grey or a Rey Skywalker or anything, but just to see more moments of like her kind of flexing these powers that she's learned over the course of thousands of years. The fact that she's kind of being treated as a field general, like having to be answerable to Gilgalad, I think is a little bit strange, especially since I'm fairly certain at this point, at least according to the family tree I was looking at, she would be like a great aunt of his. And so that's a little odd to me. I think I've kind of felt like she should more be being treated like a counselor, like someone he would go to for advice rather than I'm going to tell you what to do now. And I mean, I think we do see the start of that in like in the end of season 2. I think it was interesting to see her in more of just an all white ensemble, no armor, no weapons on her, just that ring. And it's like, oh, this is a little more of the Galadriel that we're familiar with.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's always a little complicated when it comes to trying to adapt a story, and especially when, you know, it could very easily just become a walking story where it's like, oh, so and so is traveling here. Oh, now they're traveling there, but with very little like conflict or martial action in between. They're trying to, I think, compress timeline and compress aspects of the story so that can be more like the action we get in like Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers.
Yeah.
I will say seeing Elrond and Gilgalad at the battle for Eregion, I thought was amazing. The conflict of Galadriel and Sauron in his fair form, I thought was geniusly done. But
Hmm.
a lot of better, a lot of more mile conscious folks have made points of like, hey, it's supposed to be about this many miles from Eregion to Khazad-dûm, and then also in these shots, it looks completely different. What's going on? It's little details like that that I will say at times I see where people are coming from. especially in a story where Tolkien himself was big on those kind of details. Even just in like writing, I was just reading over the Dead Marshes, which I'm going to have that episode dropping sometime tomorrow, actually. But I read the Dead Marshes chapter, and even just his descriptions of the Dead Marshes create a very clear picture of the world around. And with that kind of inconsistency in location, I could see why people are like, hey, that's not what it looked like in season 1. Why is it smack up against the mountains, the river running by it, when in the other one, it looked like it was like on the shore of a lake?
Mm-hmm.
You know, little
Yeah,
details, I think, will always be the bane for stories like that.
right. Especially when Tolkien was so detailed in a lot of things. Yeah.
I mean, everyone makes the joke about him describing a tree in the middle of a field, and you're just like, mm-hmm, we know it's a tree. Moving on.
It's good. Yeah. So, what do you think with, Elrond? It's again, it's like a small thing, but still, it's like Elrond gets the ring later, but
Hmm.
and it's one thing, a side thing with like the ring kind of being passed around
Yeah.
to different people from Galadriel, but like I know Elrond, he gets the ring because he gets it from Galadriel in that last episode,
Yeah.
and he uses it to help heal Galadriel,
Hmm.
which is interesting. I mean, of course, they're trying to bring in that, hey, like this is Elrond's healing power, but like, do you feel like it was like too soon for him to be using a ring?
Not necessarily. I think it did fit in well with his character arc from the beginning, because at the beginning of the season, he's like, mm-mm, we know who gave us the knowledge of these now. We should not be using this. But then as time goes on, that lesson he gets from Círdan being like, yes, you know how they were made, but with your intentions behind using them, that's the important part. And what friend isn't going to advise his friends on the use of it? I think it wasn't too soon. I think it was a case where Elrond really had to use one of the rings for himself to kind of get a sense of like how evil they were, because the elven rings, even in the lore in the books, they're the only ones that Sauron did not actually touch. So from that aspect, they are probably about as pure a rings as you're going to get. But his concern, understandably, at the beginning of season 2 is that, hey, this ring is uh, these were created by our enemy, our arch enemy at this point. We can't, nope, we can't use these. But then Círdan, at this point, the oldest and wisest elf in Middle Earth, had literally been there since the elves first awoke at the beginning of the world. He's telling them, but what friend isn't going to stand by his friends and counsel them? Basically saying that it's like, you know what? Yes, you're upset that they're wanting to use these rings, but that's not an excuse to just bury your head in the sand, disappear. A good friend is going to stay around to make sure that power is being used properly. And these are your friends using these rings, not the enemy. Kind of giving more rise
So
to
you feel
that.
like, yeah.
Yeah, sorry,
So
go ahead.
you think that the idea of like Elrond being extremely cautious about them is an accurate way of like portraying his attitude towards the rings
I
at
think
first?
so. Because especially for him, he knows the danger of magical items, because the Silmaril, that has plagued his family for generations, even all the way back to his ancestors Beren and Luthien. They got in trouble because of one of the very Silmarils that his family ends up holding on to. So he knows all about enchanted magical items that have a cost with them. So I think he's completely right to be that reticent and that like, guys, this is a bad idea. But then Galadriel, he first sees it used truly for good when Galadriel heals that member of their company before she hands the ring off to him. And so it's showing him that's like, okay, this is power we didn't know we had available to us. And then he's not able to help heal Galadriel, I think, if he hadn't seen it done first. Like, I think that probably could have been the start to his, I guess, lessons in healing.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about because it seems that like the way Tolkien wrote it more was that, hey, you get this ring and you keep it, especially for the
Right.
elves, right? They kind of like if they keep it close, they're not gonna like lose this because this is
Yeah.
a big part to them, making it at Middle Earth. So it
And
does
they keep it
seem that
incredibly
it's
secret. Yeah.
right. So it does seem like it's a little bit that idea is like very loosely played with the show. But
If
you
some
don't
of
you
these
don't you
people
don't
are,
think yeah, I was gonna
oh,
say, but you don't. But that's not as big of a deal for you for like the show.
not as much, because even still, it's like, okay, by the end of the season, it's only Elrond, Gil-galad, Galadriel, and Arondir that know about these rings.
Or like Kurdan
Yeah.
and
And I mean, yes, there was the group of elves standing there, which that scene, I will also say that one, you got me there. You got me there. Because there's the scene where Gil-galad is singing his song of lament. And then Círdan comes up and is like, hey guys, check this out. You know, and then heal the tree in front of everybody, which I forgot about that for a moment. But I think even still, for the majority of like the elves who witness that, it's something that they understand is secret enough and is valuable enough that it's like, yeah, we're not just going to advertise that we have these. And even as far as the passing off of rings, it was only passed off to people that they knew had it. Now, should Galadriel have blabbed to Adar about it? No.
uh,
That part, I was just kind of like, I was like, what
uh,
are you doing? No, he
yeah,
cannot know that you have it.
yeah,
Because then
yeah.
he goes straight for Elrond when he sees him. That just, that part, I was just kind of like, oh, oy. Just because he seems like a friend does not mean you should trust him.
Uh huh. Yeah. Well, that's really cool to see Elrond portrayed in the show and done done I think pretty well, overall.
Yeah.
And I guess one last thing that I'd ask is, what would you on a kind of a rating scale, like A to F,
Yeah.
what would you give the Rings of Power show? Now let's
So,
talk about
oh,
more of the lore side of things.
yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
lore side of things, and then just kind of like enjoyment.
Mhm.
How about we do both?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the important way for me to start it off is to season one. I'll be honest, season one, from a lore standpoint, I gave it about a C minus, which for
Okay.
me, I
Yeah.
felt like that was being pretty critical. The things that bothered me about it were the creation of the elven rings first. That part, I was like, no, they were the last ones made, because while Celebrimbor was making them was when he realized, oh crap, Sauron made the one. And that's how they know to, nope, we got to keep these hidden away. That's why Sauron never touched them. And then there was just the, I'm sorry if folks liked the Harfoot, I did not. It just kind of
Yeah.
felt like they didn't for me it didn't necessarily bring anything to the story,
True.
but from an enjoyment standpoint, I would have probably, I probably still would have had it at like a C minus. Uh, they're showing this whole army of Numenor riding to the defense of the Southlands, and it just kind of felt a little anticlimactic to me because it's like, okay, this is a relatively small engagement that's actually taking place. We never hear of the Southlands again, so it kind of just was like, we know this place isn't going to be around in the second or later in the third age. We know it's not going to be there. It just kind of felt like they were trying to run before they could walk. The fact that they had a cavalry charge when the Numenorians are written as being men who had horses but didn't typically use them for war. And largely that's because the Numenorians were supposed to be tall enough that, quite frankly, it'd be a little too difficult to use a horse effectively. And then, of course, just the arrival of Gandalf, the stranger, in that fashion. It's like, no, he's supposed to have come across the sea on a boat disguised as an old man with the other
Yeah.
Istari. So that those things kind of bugged me.
Mm-hmm. So that would be kind of like the second season. Yeah.
But yeah, then going into season 2, it made them showing how Halbrand Sauron came to be. I appreciated showing how he ended up on that random raft. I liked that. Seeing Sauron in fair form, like an elf, I thought was really good. Getting to really see how he slowly twists them around his finger to the point where he has literal control of their very bodies. I thought that was incredible. And then just the interactions between him and Celebrimbor, especially once Celebrimbor realizes, oh crap, I messed up. That was such a that was such a good moment of like, okay, now we're in the thick of it. It's too late to go back now. So the most he can try and do is try to keep these rings out of Sauron's hands. Bombadil
Right.
Bombadil was a little odd to me. They were kind of turned him more into a Yoda character, for which I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that. But still, the stuff that he said is stuff that Gandalf enough uses later on in how he gives advice to the hobbits, that it's like, okay, I'll humor you. And then, of course, the Battle of Eregion, I was excited to see that put on film. Because really, as far as like elves in combat, we don't, unless it's like Legolas doing his thing, for the most part, we don't get as much scenes of just like elf and orc combat against each other.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I thought that was cool to see that kind of really the golden age of elves in combat. Just how Sauron was able to kind of twist all the pieces in place, though, to even though at that time he did not have a standing army of his own, but he was able to use Adar and his desire to free the orcs to accomplish what he wanted. I ended up overall, lore-wise, I gave it a B. And same with enjoyment, like a B to B plus.
That's a big difference.
Oh yeah.
That's a pretty good difference
Well,
between the
and I
two
felt like
seasons.
they heard a lot of our complaints for season 1. And I at least felt like, you know what? They really heard us and were like, hey, okay, we kind of went our own direction a little bit, but we're going to try and bring that back. And I forgot to mention even all the stuff going on in Numenor at this time. I was like, oh, snap, we're going to get Sauron seducing the Numenorians into serving Morgoth.
Right.
Which, if you've read the Akalabeth, The Downfall of Numenor, that is a amazing, amazing story. And just
Right.
I think, especially as Christians today, no matter where you stand politically on any issue, it goes to show how we do need to be careful of what is getting put through by our leaders, because you can get really easily to get kind of caught up in this. C.S. Lewis was calling it like a Christian nationalism. It's really easy to get caught up in that kind of thing when in reality it's like, you know what? No, first and foremost, we are Christians. It is dangerous for us to become Christian, and we're either fully in with
Right.
Christ or we're not. So no matter where you
Just kind
fall
of
on the political sides, it's important to remember that at the end of the day, we are Christians. That is our uniting front as believers. And we need to be careful not to let ourselves get carried away until we look back and realize, whoa, we've become Numenor. We have turned away from what we know is right.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's neat to see how, the there are a lot of different comparisons to make with our world and the way Tolkien wrote things and his worldview as well. And I think, yeah, with the, you know, Numenorians having to decide whether, to serve Sauron or to,
Or to stick with the
ultimately
faithful.
or to stick with the faithful and serve Iluvatar in the end. That, yeah, the, it's, it's like kind of things like that that still make his world still kind of relatable to us, and it's not just a strict like fantasy world that we can't really understand. But
Yeah,
yeah, so thanks, Alex, for coming on and helping to just giving your 2 cents on that, and
of
appreciate
course.
the yeah, yeah, just covering Elrond and some other stuff in the Rings of Power too. So
Of course. I appreciate you having me.
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and catch you for our next episode. And thanks. Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. We're on YouTube or Facebook under the tag at the White City Podcast.